welcome everybody to the first of many Chuck Jones Creativeside Chats. What we want to do with these are highlight creativity, highlight great Chuck Jones stories from family and others in the industry that have learned and been inspired by Chuck. And today we are going to start off with Chuck's grandson, Mr. Craig Kausen. And before I throw a question out to him, just to kind of give you an idea of the setup, we're looking at about 30 minutes. The first 20 minutes is some questions by me with Craig, some chit-chatting, and then the last 10 minutes we're going to open it up for Q&A. You'll see in your chat there, you should have possibly a little blue hand that comes up for raise your hand. That just kind of helps us see people that, if we can't see everybody in the grid view, that wants to ask a question, you can throw a question in the chat, and then Scott will be able to see those, and he'll kind of prompt us to who's got a question coming up, and Craig will go ahead and answer those for you. So we'll do that about 20 minutes in. So I'm going to kick this off with a super simple question. I'm a huge Chuck Jones fan. I've been a big Chuck Jones fan since I was little, and I watched Looney Tunes cartoons as good parents did. And I had 3 hours on a Saturday morning, and little did I know until I got into high school and I went to the library. I was a big animation fan. That's what I wanted to do. And I was looking through books that my high school library had, and I saw Chuck Amuck. And I'm like, that's interesting. Chuck Amuck, there's, you know, Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny on the cover. So I opened it up and I started to read through it and realized that this was the man that was responsible for my classic music knowledge, my gags, my timing, my love of animals, and all things insanely hilarious. So coming from that to now, I can only imagine that growing up with the legendary Chuck Jones was infinitely more adventurous than just reading about it in a book. So Craig, what was it like growing up with a legend in Chuck Jones?
Yeah, we're supposed to now. Nice preamble to great stories. That doesn't put me on the spot at all, which is nice. But I think you know, I do over the last, well, I mean, Chuck's been gone for 18 years now. But even when I was traveling with him, or before I even came into the company nearly 30 years ago, I got the question a lot: what was it like growing up with Chuck Jones? And you know, a lot of people, I think, have the impression, because Chuck had such an amazing wit, that he would have been funny, slapstick, Robin Williams-ish, whatever it is. But he was really more, he had a very sophisticated wit and humor. So, you know, when we grew up, no one knew who he was. He wasn't famous. He wasn't, no one even knew his name. The only guy that named Chuck Jones, I remember being in 6th grade and somebody goes, you know, your grandfather's Chuck Jones? And I went, yeah. He goes, you mean Chuck Jones, the magic man? The guy that does those magic shows? And I went, no, it was a local magician that was traveling around the region. And no, he did things like Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner and stuff like that. And the response was always, oh, okay, yeah, not the magic man. That's too bad. So I think the realization came to me when I was probably in my 20s. And I think it really was when he started to get some feedback, when he started in the art business and going to galleries and whatnot in the late 70s, early 80s and things like that. Before that, he just did what he loved to do. He made cartoons. And so we grew up watching cartoons, obviously. I always thought it was pretty cool that we got to see cartoons when we wanted to, not just when the television wanted us to, because I grew up in Orange County, and my parents moved back from the East Coast when I was about 2 or 3 years old. And my grandmother moved down in the late 60s from Los Angeles because she got tired of Hollywood and being up there, and she wanted to be around us. So, but I remember he'd come down on the weekends because he was still making cartoons in the 60s when he was doing the Grinch and all that kind of thing. And he'd bring his personal 16 millimeter films with him down to the house, and he'd come back on Friday afternoon. I know he'd leave early to beat Friday traffic. So he'd come down Friday midday or whatnot and spend the weekend down there. And we'd go visit him at my grandmother's place. But I remember we had multiple Bell and Howell, those blue Bell and Howell projectors. I'm sure some of you remember seeing those, you know, where you put on the 16mm things and then you turn it on and you get that, and then the take up reel. And we learned probably at 3 or 4 years old how to create or be the projectionist. And it was always basically a fight between my brother and me. It wasn't much of a fight. He was older and bigger than I was, but you know, we got selected to be the projectionist. And but then we get to run maybe 6 or 7 cartoons that he had brought down. He was long past Warner Brothers, so these were things for him that he did 10 or 15 years before, or even more than that. But we got to sit with him with, usually they're the 3 of us grandkids. My mother was there at some times, but there were sometimes it was just my grandmother and grandfather sitting there, the 5 of us watching the cartoons in his living room down in Colonel Amar, just listening to that. And then you'd wait, what would it take? A minute before you got through the film, and then took the take up reel and spun it out real fast and put it back, and then put on the new one. And then he might give a little preamble to it of, you know, somebody that did something. At 4 or 5, at 6, I didn't really remember a lot of those comments, but I knew he would say those types of things. So, you know, it was a pretty fun part of growing up. But for us, he was just a grandfather to be around. So, you know, like everybody else's grandfather, everybody had a grandfather. Most people had a grandfather. And there were a lot of grandfathers that were a lot cooler than Chuck. At least that's what I thought at the time. There was a guy who managed a Gold's Gym back then, and you know, he could like lift 400 pounds or something like that. I always thought that was one of the coolest grandfathers around. He had biceps like were just the size of a mountain. But so that's part of it.
So you grew up, I mean, without really maybe understanding then, because life is just normal, right? So, you know, your grandfather's normal. He just made the best cartoons in the world. And you get to view these things firsthand, right? You get to be the projectionist that shows these kind of things. Was there a moment that you had as you were growing up where maybe it became known? So like that person who said, oh, Chuck Jones, and they thought it was the magician, right? Was there a point where someone said, oh, that Chuck Jones, and it was that Chuck Jones?
Well,
and then
yeah.
that
I mean, there were
connection was made.
times. I remember there was actually, there's a couple people throughout my childhood that actually kind of got it, that this was not a normal thing. Because he would come to school sometimes and meet our class or make a presentation, you know, because he would, because he'd gracefully do that. So I just dropped my phone. Hang on just a second. But but I remember, and every time he'd go to hundreds of schools when I remember growing up, and he would get asked to go out all the time, especially in the 60s and 70s. And of course, you know, he makes a presentation and everybody then is like, you know, whether you're in 1st grade or you're, you know, 10th grade, they're like, can we have a drawing? Can we have a drawing? And he said, he said, you know, I tell you, make a deal. If you send me a note, just send me a letter. Here's my address, you know, whatever it was. And if you send me a letter, I'll send you a drawing. And most everybody, 99.9% of everybody who was given that opportunity didn't do it. And just because it's like, well, I got to write a letter, and for what and why? Yeah, I know, Ben, your face, exactly. So so one of the guys that I know, it's like, huh? What?
Do you, like, you know how many Chuck Jones drawings, originals of his I have, and what I geek out? Could I write a letter? Oh, I could write a letter. Go ahead, you continue. So I could write a letter.
So he'd always say that, and there were some that did, but most didn't. But I had a friend that I met in 7th grade, and we met in algebra class. Back then in 7th grade, having algebra was a really advanced thing. Now you've got, like, you know, 4-year-olds doing algebra and then calculus at 10. But back then it was kind of advanced. So we bonded in math, and in 7th grade we met, and his name was Mark Sklansky. And for some reason he knew that this is kind of cool. So he and we went to school all the way through high school, so 6 years together, and we were good friends. And so he wrote a letter that first year in 7th grade, and then I think Chuck came back either 8th grade or maybe when we were in high school, or there was some other place, and he made the offer again. So Mark wrote him another letter and sent him another drawing. Well, I know that this is the case. I didn't know this really until about 8 years ago, when we'd stayed in touch the whole time, and he became a pediatric cardiologist. You know, he was like valedictorian guy, that super smart guy in school that always is like, really? But he's now the chief of pediatric cardiology at UCLA, which is my alma mater. And then I went to see him because we'd always talked about bringing Chuck's work and joy and, you know, these types of images around his patients, you know, because he's got kids all and parents, and it's the families coming in difficult times. And so finally, about 8 years ago, when he became chief up at UCLA, he said, you know, let's get together and talk about this. He goes, I brought these in. I just wanted to show you. And he reaches in and he pulls out these the drawings and the notes that from 7th grade and 8th or 9th grade that he had still kept, and now he has in his office. And you know, disgusting frames that looked like they were eating the paper away. So we reframed it for him, which was a good thing for his artwork. But he goes, yeah, I kind of knew it was a cool thing. So my brother and I both wrote notes both times. My brother wasn't even in the class, yet he wrote him a note too, and he sent him, you know, so they've got these couple things. But now in this at UCLA in the pediatric cardiology department, we now have, I think, 24 works of art that have been hung throughout there. So you come in and here's Bugs Bunny in a doctor's outfit saying, "What's up, doc?" And then there's huge mural type things as you walk down the hallway. Each of the rooms where they're meeting with the doctor, the nurses and whatnot, all have a theme and whatnot. It was all because really that connection back then, and he knew he had that personal connection with Chuck. And now everybody who comes in is like, wow, this is so great.
So what I love about that, and Craig, you and I have a story on Chuck's legacy that we won't go into today because that'll be for another time at Walt Disney Studios, our freak out day, if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
When, you know, the legacy of Chuck and how he touched people, because he wasn't just one of those people that he did what he did. You know, he thought of himself highly. Never one of that, you know, take your work, but never yourself that seriously, his quote, right? And when he got into his generosity and giving back and, you know, just mentoring people, period, I thought was fascinating. We'll get into the Disney story some other time, but what I love the personal. So you mentioned like kind of being a part, like he got a drawing, right? So this doctor gets a drawing, it affects him. He's got all the stuff up now in the Children's Hospital. But all that inspiration for those films, which led to all these legendary moments, had to have some muses, right? And I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, my dad was a preacher, right? So I was the subject of numerous sermon illustrations, right? Gosh, do I love those, right? Dad would mention some story about, you know, about me, and it would tie in spiritually something into the Bible and into the message, right? So yeah, favorite, not so much. But so that's the, you know, being a part of somebody's work, right? However, you had a different twist on things, because not only is your grandfather a legendary animation director, artist, and everything else, but he's got the greatest family at his disposal for his muses. And I think what the most legendary story that I hear in all of this is there's no seals around for him to draw. He's doing the white seal. He's, you know, trying to get some model work done for how seals move and all that other kind of stuff. And when you have no physical seals around, you make a seal.
Yeah.
Craig, how did he, and it has to move. It's not like you can take some pillows and, you know, put some diving flippers on it and then, oh, let's see. No, this thing's got to move. So Craig, how would you make a seal?
Well, it's not how I would make a seal. It obviously is how Chuck. So Chuck did incredible research. He went to Chouinard Art Institute at the age of 15 and went through their 3-year fine arts program. And anatomy and life drawing were a big part of what he learned back then, what he studied. And he drew all of his life. He really fell into animation, but he always did research. When he did Rikki Tikki Tavi, he found films. Rather than going and finding a cobra, he found films of a cobra, which was a lot safer thing. But when he did the White Seal, the Kipling classic in the 70s, my grandmother took, it was only my brother and me this time. We went down to San Diego and went to all the shows, and we saw Shamu and we saw the dolphin show and whatnot. But while the three of us were at the shows, Chuck had gotten permission to go behind the scenes to really draw all the mammals and anything that he was going to have in there as far as sea lions. And he found there's a big difference between seals and sea lions. The way that the anatomy is encased in there, and a sea lion, which is what the white seal actually is, has the same, like any mammal, has the same physical anatomy, with the bone structures. The skeletal system of any mammal is going to be the same, whether it's, you know, the humerus or the femur or the tibia and whatnot. They're just different lengths and different proportions to each other, where they connect, how they hit the ground and whatnot. Well, he found out that a sea lion actually is on their knees as they move around, so they bend differently than a seal. But also with the anatomy of a mammal encased inside of all that blubber, you know, is the same functional structure. So, you know, theoretically, he said, well, theoretically, if a human were confined the exact same way that a sea lion was, that they would have to move and swim the same way. And so theory is good, but Chuck loved to test out theories. So he brought my brother and me down. I must have been 10, and probably Todd was 11, and brought down to his house where we used to watch the 35 millimeter films, and had a little pool there. And so stood us on the deck and took out rope and confined us at basically tied us up at the ankles, the knees, the elbows, and put fins both on our hands and our feet, and threw us in the pool. And then drew us for, I bet you, half an hour. And, you know, as I usually remember, we didn't die, which is, you know, a big plus at that point. You know, these days it would be a very different story. But yeah, it was one of those moments that I really realized. At the time, it was just fun. Now I look back and I think, okay, that was probably different than most people's childhood. And so actually, I think in here, Scott sent me a picture that I think he actually sat there and sketched. And so here is Chuck's rendition of us and what we would actually look like with a sea lion and a human combined the same way. So, but you know, drawing it is one thing, but he literally threw us in the pool. And in fact, not a week ago, I took my daughter down because we just needed to get out of the house, and we went down and I showed her the house where it was. It's been remodeled and whatnot, but I'm sure that pool is still sitting back there in a you know, where he tortured us.
Well, now I know where your love of water polo come from. So
there you go. Yeah, I think that was probably the reason. It's overcoming.
30 minutes in a pool as a seal.
Anyway, so yeah, that was fun.
I love that story because you use what you got, right? So, and Chuck was obviously was well known for the films that he did, but he was a phenomenal artist. And therefore, like his love and appreciation for real life was amazing. And what I loved about what he would say, as we can see, because we're all working from home, honey, you need to pause for 1 second for me. And yeah, we got kids all over the place.
It's all the daughters.
Right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Love it. And sons.
So his love of that, and what I have found absolutely fascinating in getting to know more about Chuck, especially through you, is just his fine art tendencies, you know, and what he would impart on people in that. And that people that would come in, you know, and show him all kinds of stuff for Bugs Bunny and want to animate, and he would be like, well, how's your life drawing? You know, like, how are you studying from that? And the perfect proof in that is Craig is a seal, right? So I
Yeah,
love that.
I know.
What I
Well,
want to
he
do
was a
now is
fine
go
artist.
ahead.
He was a fine artist. Let me. There's this other image in here, and I'll put this back up if anyone wants to ask anything about it. But this is actually in the room that I am sitting in. This was one from the Chenard days of him doing life drawing. So it's pretty fun to experience his artwork and to look at the texture and whatnot, because, you know, the first and foremost, he was a fine artist. And then, like I said, you know, he came out of art school at 18 years old and, you know, in the Depression, and fell into animation because he needed to eat. So there was no real industry to strive for, and there certainly wasn't the education for it. So anyway, that's it is fun to see what he created with his own pencil or his own charcoal or his own paintbrush.
And yeah, I've gotten to handle some of those supplies as we have the Chuck Jones season of creativity rolling around. And I've gotten to physically sit at the desk as I have to set it up for the museum exhibitions. And man, do I geek out every time.
Yeah.
So what I'd want to do now is let's open it up to some questions if
Yeah.
you guys have any. I know I have lots of questions every time, you know, like as I find stuff and I'm like, Craig, what about this? What about that? And leads to super interesting stories. So guys, if you have a question, if you want to pop it in a chat, or if you want to, you know, kind of raise a hand there and we can call on you, and then you can ask Craig. Who'd like to throw the first one out?
I'll go for it.
All right, Dave.
All right, so here's my question to you, Craig. Arthur Conan Doyle grew to really dislike Sherlock Holmes and actually tried to kill him off at one point.
Yeah. Good story.
Right?
I love that.
Did your grandfather ever get sick of any of the characters that he so famously created? And if so, how did he deal with it?
Yeah, no. The answer to this, the simple and direct answer is absolutely not. He you know, I think Arthur Conan Doyle he really wanted to be, he wanted to write history books. And so, and he did this, you know, he wrote those things in order to be able to get enough money to get to where he was going. Whereas Chuck loved to draw, he loved to create, he loved to write, and he fell in love with character early because he was such a voracious reader, and the characters would come out of things like Twain. You know, I brought in a Twain book because I knew that Twain would come up, but you know, in this, it's going to disappear maybe into there. Yes, there's a vintage Twain book in our house that I actually got for him the year before he passed away, and then I got it back, which was wonderful. So I got that little piece. But his characters, he really felt that they were his children. So now maybe some of us get tired of our children, but we love them deep down, and even when we're frustrated. So, but the idea that these came out of him, that he found them inside of himself and then created them, it was a joy for him to always think of something new and to play with them and talk about them and put them in interesting positions. So no, he, especially the Looney Tunes characters, and he created other characters, you know, after the early 60s when they shut down the studio, but never once did I hear that he was tired of doing anything, any of his characters, or being asked to do anything with them. It was always, there was never enough time to do all the things that he wanted to do. He always was striving to create more films, to write more, to speak more, to meet people, to mentor, to teach. So it was always, I can't do as much as I'd like to do. And there was never, I don't remember him ever saying that he was tired of doing anything in his life. I mean, he certainly, there were certain parts of his life that he didn't necessarily enjoy or embrace wholeheartedly by choice. But, you know, it doesn't mean that everything that he did was great. You know, he acknowledged, he called them clinkers. He goes, yeah, I had clinkers. We made some clinkers in my life. But, you know, he certainly, it was always, how can I make this a little bit better? How can I keep moving this forward. And so thankfully, no, he started at 19 in the animation industry, and made his last film when he was 89. So for 70 years, he created wonderful things that he loved. So it's a good question, though. I like it.
So Bob had a question, and he asked, did he have a favorite character to draw?
You know, there's two. Those are two different questions. Are there favorite characters or favorite characters to draw? I'll go back to his children, and he'd answer that question. You know, as far as a favorite character, he goes, you know, do you have children? Oftentimes, the person would say yes, and he'd say, well, do you have a favorite? And then they go, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily articulate that. Based upon, and so you kind of like, okay, you know, and if you do have a favorite, you probably won't say it out loud, because then you have to deal with all the other ones. But you know, he had a favorite child because, you know, he had one child, my mother. But the favorite one to draw, yeah, I mean, he loved, you know, Daffy and Wiley and whatnot. But looking at the body of work that I get to play with on occasion, and that people in our company have been able to play with, Bugs Bunny is certainly the most versatile character because there's more scenes of Bugs Bunny in the drawings and the things than any other character. I think there are certain characters like Daffy and Wile E. Coyote that are probably more dear to his heart as far as the difficulties that Daffy comes in contact with, and Wile E. Coyote being the, you know, never victorious seeker of the unobtainable. That probably resonates a lot with Chuck. But Bugs was probably the one that he had the most fun figuring out what was gonna happen in a certain situation. And so I would say, to draw, I would say Bugs Bunny, just as a guess.
Good answer. Bugs is, I don't know how you can't. I have a sketch from Chuck that he did, an original from Baton Bunny, and as soon as I saw that drawing, what I loved about what he did and the work that he did, especially when he was drawing characters and his inking, was just the absolute personality that he would get from the lines, right? Which is why I love the sketches. Every single line, which is why I love the sketches even more than I love the production cells, because to me, the energy and the character always came from the drawings. So Baton Bunny, the one that, as soon as you showed me that, I'm like, yeah, we're gonna have to have that one.
I'm gonna steal that now, which is good. Yeah.
Yes, that's gonna have to come back with me. So did anybody else have a question for Craig about growing up with Chuck Jones, or what was this like? I'll turn into a grid view so I can see everybody. You can just unmute if you want.
Looks like we're good.
We're good. So I've got one last question. So Craig, Chuck won 4 Oscars in his career, and his capping it off with his Lifetime Achievement Award that Robin Williams presented him in, was it 1996?
Yeah.
And so how did you come to a career point like that, and at that point, you know, all the body of work that you've done, and you're getting a Lifetime Achievement Award. What were when he came back from that, what was it? Did he have a reaction to it? Was it like, all right, like, how do you deal with a Lifetime Achievement? Does that mean it's all over? Is it done? I've achieved it all? Like, how did that impact him when he received that award? What impact did that have on Chuck?
You know, I think he was humbled by it for sure. And, you know, he won 2 Academy Awards in 1950 for So Much for So Little, a documentary short subject that was that year, and For Sentimental Reasons. And although he didn't get to keep them because the producer got to keep them, you know, he felt like, okay, we've gotten to a plateau. And it was always a we, you know, it was never a me, because he knew that his team was the reason for his success. And you know, he surrounded himself with incredible people, you know, Maurice Noble and you know, the animators, Ben Washam and Kenny and all of those guys that were on his team, Mike Maltese, the writer. And so it was always a we have achieved something. So there was both a camaraderie as well as wanting to achieve, because there were 3 units at Warner Brothers at any given time, and like Friz Freleng and either Bob Clampett early or Bob McKimson later on, and others that came through. But Chuck and Friz were really the mainstays for those 30 plus years. And so the achievement of it was great. But I heard him say, and he said, I'll accept the award. And he got, he had how many different honorary doctorates has he got? He got the Chevalier d'Arts award in 2000, I think it was, from France. I mean, these are the biggest awards for creative inspiration and acknowledgement in the world, plus the Academy Awards. And he said, thank you. I appreciate the acknowledgement of it, but as soon as it's done, I will put it back on the shelf, and it's what's next. What can I bring, and what's my next project? Because that's where the real joy of it is. Not even the finished product of it, and certainly not the awards, but it's the process of it. It's the how can I do something new to bring it to my craft, whether it would be the fine art, whether it was the animation, whether it was the writing, whether it was the mentoring somebody. How can I do all of this better to raise all of our game? And so really that was his goal in life, was to inspire that in others and to continue to dig down deep and find that in himself every day. And it's a chore. It's not just, you don't wake up and go, what's going to happen today? It's get up. He always drew. He drew every day that he was physically able to, every single day, a minimum of 20 drawings every single day. And thousands of drawings, a week at times, where he would literally, dive in and do those 100,000 bad drawings that you got to do just, and he was told that, when he was 15 years old at art school. But he did millions and millions of drawings, I'm sure, during his lifetime, most of which were a learning process. So 300 plus films, not all of them, but he'd learn something and try to make it a little better. So no, he never got there. And like I said, his last film was his only computer film. He and a team, he didn't care about computers. He didn't know about computers, never wanted to use a computer. He appreciated the tool, loved what John Lasseter did in those types of things. And he and John were very good friends, and appreciated the character. And Chuck mentored John in the early 70s when he was at Cal Art. So it continues to spread that way. But in 2001, he did Timberwolf. If you haven't seen it, we'll talk about it another time. But yeah, imagine a wolf whose name was Thomas T. Wolfe, and the T stands for timber. And every time he says his name, a tree falls on his head. Go. So there you go. So that was his last series of film production. So Jesse, you took your mute off. Did you have a question?
No, I'm good. Just listening. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Are you enjoying yourself?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. Is anybody not enjoying themselves? Please raise your hand. Okay, well, then good. I'm enjoying myself. Oh wait, no, wrong hand. This hand.
Can you hear me?
This hand.
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you, Bob.
Oh, good. Okay, Craig, I had one question.
Yeah.
So, were there any individuals that inspired the personalities of those characters that your grandfather drew?
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, there's a lot of inspiration for the characters, but it's not so much people as it is descriptions of things. And there were people that in Chuck-a-Muck, I'm trying to remember, that was sort of a Bugs Bunny was sort of a cross between Mae West and Groucho Marx. And so there were characterizations, there were assets that he knew and appreciated. And, and I think it's probably a little late to get into Wile E. Coyote and its inspiration, but we'll another time. He did in Mark Twain's Roughing It read a passage about a coyote when he was 7 years old, when Chuck was 7 years old, about a coyote that Mark Twain described. And that lived with him in his visualizations that he then pulled out 30 years later for Roadrunner and Coyote. So I think there's certainly characters within the cartoons that were like characterizations of, and you see their names and whatnot. If you look at the fat opera singer in nope.
Giovanni Jones, long-haired hair.
Yes, long-haired hair. Thank you. I knew there was a hair in there. Where they were, where you got Carlo Jonesy and you've got Mike Maltese and there's a lot of characters in there. Like Friz Freeling created Yosemite Sam, and absolutely did. It was Friz. You know, Friz was an angry, loud man at times, and but he was surly and whatnot. I do think that Daffy Duck, though, you know, was kind of wild and crazy to begin with, and they were looking for a voice for him. And Leon Schlesinger, the owner of the studio back then, had a lisp, and they were trying to figure out a new voice for Leon or for Daffy, and somebody goes, "Oh, let's use Leon's voice." And so they got a lisp out, and they're, you know, the Daffy Duck that we know today has got all that. But then halfway through that first film, they all figured out that Leon was actually going to see this, and they'd all get fired. So they didn't, which was fortunate. But he didn't even notice that it was his voice or his lisp that it was in Daffy Duck's voice. But so not necessarily a single person, Bob, but definitely the characterizations that come out of all of us, I think, can conglomerate into those. So good to see you, Bob.
So Robert put up Dorothy Parker and Errol Flynn.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I knew that it was that. It was a lady and a guy. How's that?
There's a lady and a guy. So I just want to take a moment to say thank you to everybody who jumped on today to be a part of our first Chuck Jones Creativeside Chat. This is something that we're going to do more of as we move forward. There are a plethora of fantastic stories, inside information, inside baseball, if you will, on, you know, Chuck and what he did, how he did things, who he worked with, who he inspired. As we kind of grow this series, I can tell you from personal experience, and I'm not going to go into the Disney story today, but Dave, I will do the Disney story. It takes a minute, but I'll give you the teaser to it. And this is what I love being a part of, the furthering the Chuck Jones legacy, right? Because he inspired me when I was 6 and 7 years old watching his stuff, and then when I was a teenager reading his autobiography, and now to be a part of the Chuck Jones Center for Creativity and inspiring other people through his philosophies and what he did through his characters and the way he thought. Here's the teaser. Eric Goldberg, right, is a legend. I've met him several times. I melt into the floor every time because he's one of my top 3 all-time animators that I've ever wanted to meet. And correct me if I'm wrong, Craig, but Eric Goldberg is Chuck considered to be himself, the next iteration of himself. Is that right?
It wasn't so much his iteration of himself. He was pushed in the like 1999 or 2000, and he listed a handful of animators at the time that were the best, because they said, well, you know, who's the best animator in the world today? And he just went boom, 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 and well, but the first board of the organization back in 1999 said, well, you got to pick one because we want to honor them and acknowledge them. And he goes, all right, if I got to push, I'd say Eric Goldberg is the best hand-drawn animator today. And there were others that are, I mean, he said, you can't pick one because they're so good. But he acknowledged that, and just like Chuck would always be humble, Eric Goldberg would be like, well, that's very nice of him, you know. But and we're gonna get him out here at some point to answer your questions as well, for sure. But go ahead.
So yeah. Eric Goldberg is for those who may not know, right? Eric Goldberg lead animator of the Genie and Aladdin, directed Pocahontas. I mean, the list is long and distinguished, and I've watched this guy draw in 15 minutes to do a complete scene. It's insane. So there's that, and then we got to see Eric Goldberg's office, and then we got up to the director's floor in the animation building. Dave, that's a story where Craig and I kept it all inside. And then when we left the studio, after experiencing what we will tell you at a later date, we freaked out on the outside. So it was great to watch directors like Byron Howard and other story artists, how they've been inspired by Chuck, how Chuck personally even reached out to some of them. Byron still had the letter from Chuck. So we're going to unveil more of those stories and then have some of those people on for the Creative Side Check. Eric Goldberg is a kick, man. You're going to love him. So stay tuned for that. Craig, thank you so much for putting all this together in the Creative Side Chat. I love, this is the kind of stuff that I just geek out on. So it's always a pleasure to sit and talk with you.
Thank you all for coming today.
So have a wonderful night, everybody. Dave, we'll enjoy the snow that you just had here in Chicago, that you had in Colorado, and it'll be hopefully a lot warmer on the next Creative Side Chat. Have a great evening, guys.